Hello, welcome to our Sustainable Futures class dedicated to Sustainable Development Goal 8, titled Decent Work and Economic Growth. My name is Piotr Szwedo, and I teach international public law with a special focus on international trade and investment law here at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. I'll be presenting this course with my two PhD students, with Lena.
Hello, my name is Lena, and my primary research focus is the interrelation of international public law and science.
And with Cyprian.
Hello, I'm Cyprian. I'm a lawyer and linguist working on the interlinks between sustainable development and EU trade policy.
What we will do now, we'll try to share the table of content and briefly present it. Yes, and as an introductory note, we would like to explain that Sustainable Development Goal 8 is one of the so-called prosperity goals of Sustainability Development Goals agenda. It's strictly correlated with Sustainable Development Goal 1, and some would say it's the most important goal, as it was the first goal, titled No Poverty. Economic growth is, as you may imagine, as you may think, the most important tool of fighting poverty.
And this is why in the first part, we will try to define both economic growth and sustainable development, and to explain how they are linked with each other and if they are friends or foes.
In the second part, we'll explain a tool titled Aid for Trade. It was an instrument, and it still is a program developed by the World Trade Organization, which enables developing countries, least developed countries, and landlocked countries to fully participate in the global trading system.
And then in the third part, I will try to present a bit about economic growth in developing countries as a target of the SDGs on the example of General System of Preferences, which is a tool similar to Aid for Trade, which is used to support developing countries in obtaining a stronger position in international trade.
Afterwards, in section number 4, we will look at the problem of decoupling growth from environmental degradation. Especially, we will think about the need to reduce material use while sustaining economic growth, which is also important in the context of Sustainable Development Goal number 12. Then, we will look at the idea of growth based on increase of productivity. In essence, on knowledge-based economy, on entrepreneurship, as well as non-discrimination. From that, we will proceed to explore the issue of non-discrimination in employment, as well as the problems linked to employment of youth.
In the next part, I will try to look at different instruments of public international law dedicated to prohibit forced labor, child labor, and slavery.
And then in the last part, we'll talk about labor rights in general, and then how they are enforced through trade on the basis of a particular case between the EU and South Korea over labor law infringements.
Yes, welcome to our class, and we hope that you will enjoy it.
So in this module, we'll try to define economic growth and sustainable development and how they interrelate with each other. So starting with the definitions, sustainable development can be considered to be kind of policy, especially regarding economy, that intends to meet the needs of the current generation, but at the same time without restricting the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So basically, it's about having development that doesn't deplete resources or doesn't pollute our environment, and in this way, it shouldn't restrict the future generations in their own policies. And economic growth is more about an increase in production. It doesn't say a lot about how this increase happens, so if it should or shouldn't be sustainable, but this is an increase which can be economically checked and compared from one period to another. So as you can imagine, there are many interrelations between those two, because to some extent, sustainable development needs economic growth to still be able to fulfill its objectives, but at the same time, economic growth can lead to environmental pollution or to depletion of resources. So one of the definitions that we can propose to connect those two ideas is that economic growth, when it is to some extent at least moderated by non-economic values, can bring us sustainable development. So a kind of development that fulfills the objectives that we mentioned about not compromising the abilities of future generations to conduct their own policy. So those ideas can be excluding or enforcing each other. And as I said before, when it comes to sustainable development, it needs economic growth, but at the same time, economic growth can be dangerous to sustainability because, broadly speaking, economic development induces more consumption, more production, and this, of course, doesn't have to be sustainable. So one of the real-life examples of the thing we are discussing, so this kind of conflict or reinforcement of those two ideas, is rapid development of some developing countries, such as China, although there is a conflict between the US and China, whether China should be considered as a developing country. But developing countries, when they are at the first stages of their economic growth, they tend to be more polluting. They tend to not use so advanced technologies. They tend to have a lot of industry. So this is the example of China, which has gone through a very rapid economic development. But at the same time, as you can see on the graph, China amounts to the most of current gas emissions between the countries. So this kind of rapid development, rapid economic development comes with a cost. And this cost is less sustainable development that can cause harm to the environment. But at the same time, one of the goals of sustainability is to increase equality between the countries and also to enable developing countries to fully participate in policies that intend to protect the environment and to create better sustainability. And this, of course, needs economic growth because those countries need funds to participate in such projects, and also to minimize the differences between the countries. We need developing countries, of course, to gain those abilities to participate in international trade, to build infrastructure. So one of the difficult questions is how we can provide for a situation when those countries can develop well when it comes to their economies, but at the same time not to harm environment with their possibilities, with their abilities, which are for sure not so extensive as those of developed countries.
And now a few words about the aid for Trade initiative, which was an initiative launched by the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization is, as maybe you know, a leading global organization responsible for trade liberalization. Its functioning is based on a paradigm that liberalization of trade, so the elimination of trade barriers, is a win-win game for all participants of the global trading community. The Aid for Trade initiative was mentioned in Target 8A of the Sustainable Development Goal 8. It had and it has still two purposes. First, to provide market access for developing countries to the markets of developed states. Very often, there's a situation that the economic condition or the whole economic situation of a given state depends on the possibilities of exporting of a given particular good. Very often, these may be an agricultural good or goods like coffee, like bananas, or like pineapples. Without this access, the situation of those developing countries, or even more often least developed countries, it's getting really bad. The second purpose of the Aid for Trade initiative is to provide and to facilitate investment. Economic operators want to, or may be willing to settle down, found the economic initiatives, enterprises, businesses in developing states, but they need additional security. They need some legal and economic stability, which is a condition for the decision of settling down an enterprise or a business or a company in those states. That was the second purpose of the Aid for Trade initiative. It was, as we have just mentioned, first and foremost addressed to developing countries. And on the map, which is the upper map here on the slide, you see developing countries marked in dark yellow color. But there's a particular group within developing countries, which we call the least developed countries, so the poorest countries, which are in a very specific and special need. They are the special target, I would say, of this initiative. Also, the Aid for Trade initiative was addressed to one more category, which overlaps with the previous two, which are the landlocked countries. So those countries which do not have direct access to the seas. And by that mean, they do not have access to main trading routes. So the economic condition for trade is much more complicated, much more difficult. How the Aid for Trade initiative would function? Well, the fundamental goal would be to expand the quantity and quality of goods and services supplied by developing countries to world markets at competitive prices. And in order to do so, we need to build the trade capacity of those states. And by building the trade capacity, we mean three aspects: human capacity, institutional capacity, and the infrastructure. Human capacity means professionals and governments who need additional help. They need additional advice in WTO matters, like trade lawyers, economists, skilled negotiators. Very often these are very technical, complex skills which not necessarily are possessed by specialists in a given country. They need additional training, additional help, additional professional added hint. With this human capacity overlaps the institutional capacity. Businesses and governments rely upon institutions for trade, such as customs, national standards authorities, and the delegations representing the country at the WTO. You can see this lack of institutional capacity in the first years of the function of the World Trade Organization dispute settlement, where developing countries were quite reluctant in launching those disputes because they did not necessarily have specialists or access to lawyers who would make the claim on their behalf. So human capacity and institutional capacity overlaps, but we have to add to this one more very particular and important and costly element, which is the infrastructure. And that's why we also mentioned the special situation of the landlocked countries just a moment ago. Well, without access to ports, without access to, but also to good roads or telecommunication networks, very often providing and accessing trade routes or possibility of providing some services that would be online even is very, very difficult, if not impossible. On this slide, you see two maps. On the one hand, you see a map of developed states which were donors in, and this is the map shows data from 2015, donors of countries which provided help within this Aid for Trade initiative. On the other map, you see those countries which were recipients. So that's why the countries which benefited out of this help. And you see them in different colors. The intensivity of color shows the amount, the quantity of help measured in US dollars, which those countries received thanks to this Aid for Trade initiative.
All right, so this time we'll go through how is economic growth in developing countries considered as a target of the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's start with the division between developed, developing, and least developed countries. And surprisingly, only the least developed countries are clearly defined, and only in this case we have an official list published by the United Nations that comprises of 46 countries. So developed countries and developing countries are less clearly divided. We don't have a clear definition and clear division between them. Although there are some indicators of whether a country is developed or developing. And developed countries are those that have high income economies, which can be checked, for example, through the statistics published by the International Monetary Fund. We have around 80 countries that are considered to be high income economies. We have also a Human Development Index, which considers a few other indicators to give us information about the general well-being in a country. And in this case, we have around 65 countries that have very high HDI index. So those countries, mostly in Western Europe and North America, they can be considered to be developed countries. And then we have much longer list, unofficial list of developing countries, around maybe 150 according to the IMF. Those lists, by the way, are not excluding each other. So since we don't have any kind of official list, it may happen then that some countries are considered by different institutions to be either developed or developing countries. And this is the case of Poland, actually, which by the UN is considered to be developed countries, a developed country when it comes to its HDI index, but doesn't score so well regarding its economy in the statistics published by the International Monetary Fund. So moving on to indicators that are related to developing countries, we have quite a lot of them that tell us how sustainability is achieved with the presence or with the involvement of the developing countries. You can see those targets, those indicators in the slide. And what's important, summarizing those different indicators, we can see that, generally speaking, the more flow of technology, funding, know-how we have from developed countries to developing countries, the closer we are to achieving sustainable development goals. So, for example, one of the indicators is value of financial support directed to developing countries. We have also value of investment promotion, value of aid for trade commitments, lower tariffs on goods. All that should support developing countries in both achieving sustainable development goals and also in having their presence on international markets. So one of the ways to improve the situation of developing countries is a general system of preferences, which is allowed under the WTO law. And it means that developed countries can introduce zero or lower tariffs on certain goods to help developing countries export their goods to those developed countries. And that brings a lot of benefits. So the access to the markets of developed countries is easier for developing countries, and much research suggests that there are, in fact, welfare and trade gains for developing countries. But at the same time, there are some controversies. So this kind of system can give incentives to developing countries to specialize in branches that are not advanced technologically, that are, for example, that relate to low processed goods, for example, food. And those countries can be trapped in this kind of production and export. And also, general systems of preferences, they are considered to be highly dependent on political decisions. So, for example, whether the European Union or the UK, whether they introduce such a system and whether they have a certain list of countries that can benefit from the system depends on politics. And that could be seen after Brexit, when the UK ceased to be part of the system introduced by the European Union. And some countries were left, actually. So some countries that didn't have enough economic or historic ties with the UK, they suffered a loss because they weren't included in the proposed by the UK at the beginning. So we have, as you can see, many ways of checking how the situation of developing countries can help in achieving sustainable development goals. And one of the ways of helping them is a general system of preferences, which is considered to be mostly a good thing, but there are some controversies whether in a long run it helps them. It supports those developing countries in having a strong position in international trade.
We have talked about the efforts to increase economic growth in developing countries. One question is particularly important in the context of sustainable development. Can we decouple growth from environmental degradation? In this aspect, the Sustainable Development Goal number 8 has a lot in common with the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which calls for responsible consumption and production. There are a few terms that are important for these goals. The material footprint, simply speaking, is the amount of materials we take directly from nature to meet our demand. Domestic material consumption refers to the amount of these materials used in a given country. The extraction and use of materials, of course, often harm the environment, but it cannot be denied that they contribute to economic growth. The question is, therefore, can we sustain growth and reduce material use at the same time? To answer it, we need to look at material intensity, the ratio of domestic material consumption to gross domestic product, GDP. In essence, the lower the material intensity, the less material we use to produce wealth. Here, we can see that countries which have the highest GDP import a lot, hence the big bubbles. They also use the biggest amount of materials. It should not be surprising. High GDP means high level of production, which increases material use. Furthermore, it means that those countries have plenty of money for foreign goods, the production of which also impacts the material footprint. This chart is based on data from 2019. Some of the biggest bubbles you can see in the top right corner are China, USA, India, Japan a little bit on the left, and South Korea, while small insular states are visible mostly in the bottom left part. And here we have a different chart, this time from 2015. Now the bubbles reflect the size of GDP, so they indicate the general economic health of the country. However, the higher the position of the country on the chart, the bigger its GDP per capita, so the amount of wealth per person, to simplify things. It will help us compare countries regardless of the size of their population. But the most important indicator here is the material intensity. As you can see, countries on the right need relatively more materials to produce their GDP. What we can also see is that countries where people are wealthy generally use less materials to produce their GDP, and countries where the GDP per capita is low have a higher material intensity. Why is it so? Of course, the reasons are numerous. For example, GDP may come from goods that are worth a lot, not thanks to the material used, but due to their technological advancement. This is the case of Japan, for example, where the high-tech industry plays a big role. In wealthy and peaceful societies, there is also a high demand for services, including services such as banking, which generate high income at proportionally low costs. While some geographic luckiness is needed as well, wealthy countries are in general more likely to be able to efficiently use clean energy sources, reducing extraction of fuels. On the other side of the spectrum, we have countries which, for various reasons, are not able to do the same. It includes, among others, countries which are still dependent on fossil fuels, countries where some socio-political unrests hamper economic progress, and countries with difficult living conditions, which make basic production activities especially strenuous and material consuming. Of course, some of these factors are incredibly difficult to change, but there are also some areas in which SDG number 8 might be helpful. SDG number 8 calls for increasing productivity. Ideally, we should be able to achieve more with a comparable or smaller amount of materials. We could do so by building a knowledge-based economy. While an industrial economy is built on resource-heavy production, a knowledge-based economy uses human innovativeness, information, and high-profile skills to produce wealth. Innovation is perceived as a chance to find new solutions for some of our most serious problems, including the aforementioned social and environmental issues. In this regard, a phenomenon called leapfrogging is particularly valuable. It describes a situation when a country at a lower level of advancement jumps over the intermediate levels directly to a high level. For example, when a region which used to have no telecommunications infrastructure gains a wide access to a modern mobile network without going through stages of partial connectivity and digital divide. An important legal challenge in this domain is the protection of intellectual property. On the one hand, many people would greatly benefit from easily accessible, affordable innovations. On the other hand, inventions must be economically profitable, so it's reasonable to guard them with patents. If you are interested in this dilemma, you could read, for example, about the World Intellectual Property Organization and the interesting debate on COVID-19 vaccine patents. Another important aspect is the entrepreneurship. SDG number 8 aims to support market diversification and reduce informal employment. It should, in general, result in a bigger number of companies, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, which would be more agile in their reactions to changing market circumstances and would accelerate innovativeness through competition. As more people would be formally employed, they would achieve higher levels of social security, increasing the resilience of the whole system. However, the search for optimal legal restrictions of economic freedom is an important factor. We want to make entrepreneurship easy, but at the same time, we need to provide sufficient guarantees for workers and consumers, not to mention the state budget revenues. If you'd like to explore this subject, you could, for example, check what indicators are used in different economic freedom indexes, often prepared by non-governmental organizations. Last but not least, productivity is linked to reduction of inequalities. Apart from many moral arguments supporting reduction of inequalities, there are also economic arguments. To simplify things, less poverty means more potential consumers, less discrimination in the workplace means a more numerous and diversified workforce, and fewer barriers for entrepreneurship mean a more robust economy. This is why SDG number 8 calls for income redistribution through fair fiscal policies and for equal access to jobs, insurance, banking, and various financial services. A legal challenge lies in the principle of non-discrimination and its interplay with waivers and privileges meant to level the playing field. If you'd like to think more about it, you could, for example, read about lawful discrimination, positive discrimination, affirmative actions, and the various fascinating discussions surrounding those issues. Discrimination in employment is a particularly serious problem, reflecting many social stereotypes affecting selected groups of workers. A human right to work and to just and favorable conditions of work is included in many documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and conventions of the International Labour Organization. Equal rights of women are included, among others, in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, while migrant workers are protected by the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. These are but a few examples of various instruments meant to guarantee equality in the workplace. But what are the causes for inequalities? Some of them result from differences in the needs and capabilities, resulting in non-discriminatory overrepresentation of certain groups in certain areas. Such differences are often inevitable. There are, however, also inequalities that stem from harmful practices. These practices can be a result of traditions, cultural stigma, or stereotypes. It can be also a product of discriminatory or inadequate laws and policies. Convention number 111 of the International Labour Organization lists race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, national extraction, and social origin as unlawful basis for discrimination. Other instruments of the organization emphasize also the unlawfulness of discrimination on the basis of HIV, AIDS, age, disability, family responsibilities, sexual orientation, and trade union memberships or activities. Here we can see how many different policies affect the employment of women. In some countries, it may be illegal or dangerous for women to simply commute to work on their own. Sometimes work generates too little income or is impossible to reconcile with legal and organizational constraints linked to family life. Also, in some jurisdictions, women encounter many problems when trying to start their own enterprise, not to mention that they may have legal difficulties with governance of their assets. In simple terms, whenever we observe a substandard treatment of women as members of society, the situation is bound to affect the situation of women on the labor market. Before we proceed to the most cruel and deeply illegal discriminatory practices, let's look at a different type of problem, a byproduct of inadequacy of policies in the light of social and environmental factors. Employment of young people has been affected by many changes in the social fabric. As higher education became more available, a university degree is no longer a guarantee of a stable and profitable employment. Since social security is linked to difficulties in termination of workers' employment, employers often choose such legal frameworks that allow them to employ a young, inexperienced person on much more precarious terms. It lowers the risk of employers, of course, but at the same time worsens the situation of youth in case of any life problems, for example. High living costs also weaken the economic position of young people, while changes in priorities in relationships and family planning lower the pressure of settling down, buying a house as quickly as possible, and finding a stable employment. The problem of unemployment of young people is measured by the percentage of needs NEETs. Number of youth not in employment, education, or training. Depending on the study, it can encompass different groups of 15 to 34 years old. The percentage of needs in the EU was 17.6% in 2020, with the lowest rate of 8.2% in the Netherlands, and the highest in Italy, where 29.4% of young people were unemployed. It amounts to a group of over 2 million people, out of which nearly 40% were actively seeking employment, but 20% were unavailable for various reasons, 25% were waiting for a good opportunity, and around 15% were entirely disengaged. It was also pointed out that unemployed mothers constitute a worryingly high percentage of needs in Europe. Since the problem of needs is a wider than European problem, it's a global problem, some initiatives have been created in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, just to mention the Decent Jobs for Youth initiative. SDG number 8 calls also for better and wider implementation of an existing regulation, the Decent Jobs Pact. However, we seem to be far away from the global strategy and the national strategies mentioned in the Target 8B and its related indicators. As we will see in a while, in some jurisdictions, fair employment is still not guaranteed, even on a much more basic level.
Now a few words about forced labor, child labor, and slavery in the context of the Sustainable Development Goal 8. Forced labor, child labor, and slavery are, in principle, nowadays prohibited. The context of discussion about those prohibition is related to access of cheap labor, which is very often a condition of economic growth. Economic growth requires access to labor, which is not too expensive. And of course, in the past, there was always this tendency to exploit some categories of population because they could provide cheap or even free labor. This problem is also on a theoretical level, which should be contextualized as an illustration of a phenomenon that in theory of international law, we call it fragmentation of international law. Fragmentation of international law because international law is a legal branch touching upon different problems and different contexts of international community. It regulates such aspects as international economic, or let it be trade law on the one hand, and human or labor rights on the other hand. And regulations and also goals of those subsystems of international law may sometimes collide. This is a kind of illustration of this interaction in the context of Sustainable Development Goal and human rights. Let us go back to the forced labor. Again, forced labor is a source of cheap labor. It was used very often in the past, in antiquity, when we think about, for example, the construction of the pyramids in Egypt, but also in a less distant past, like the construction of Trans-Siberian Railway. And you see some black and white pictures illustrating this process here. That's why in the 30s, a convention was adopted by the General Conference of the International Law Organization. And this convention, by the term forced or compulsory labor, means all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So in other words, a forced labor is a situation when someone has to provide labor, has to work, but without its consent, when he or she is forced to provide labor. But on the other hand, the same convention provides some exceptions to this principle or to this prohibition of forced labor. Exception number one is a compulsory military service. Yes, very often, or the majority of countries in the world in the past or nowadays had some regulations about the obligation of military service. In other countries, there may be a kind of alternative to military service, which is a civic obligation of what we call civilian service, which means that, for example, for a year or a longer period of time, a person has to work in hospitals or retirement homes for free or almost for free, without economic benefit or without an income. Also, the same forced labor convention provides an exception in a situation when the forced labor is resulting out of the conviction of a court. According to some specialists in criminology or penal law, they say that obligation to work, especially in some kinds of communities, is a better alternative than going to prison. Is a better alternative than regular penitentiary measures. In such a context, of course, it's also not a forced labor, or it's an exception to the prohibition of forced labor as it is provided in the 1930 Convention. And also, obligation to work in a situation of war or calamity or threatened calamity, so like a situation when citizens have to construct embankments in times of flood. It's for their own security. It's also not a violation of this convention. Leaving forced labor aside, let's have a few minutes of discussion about child labor. The Child Labor Convention from 1999 was also an initiative of the ILO, and it defines that all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as the sale and trafficking of children, debt, bondage, and serfdom of enforced or compulsory labor, including forced or compulsory recruitment of children for use in armed conflict, is prohibited. And unfortunately, children are still exploited, not only in context of armed conflicts, but still even in times of peace. They have to provide labor in such sectors and in very poor countries in such sectors like cocoa production, or even in such hard work as mining. And last but not least example in the context of this target 8.7 is the prohibition of slavery. We tend to believe that slavery does not exist anymore, but it's not accurate. Slavery was abolished, and we all know the history of the Civil War in the United States in the 19th century. But slavery still somehow exists, even if it's not a dominating source of work, and it's universally eliminated. Still, it somehow exists in some contexts. In the Slavery Convention from 1926, it is provided that slavery is the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. So, in other words, when a person is an object of the right of ownership. Secondly, slave trade includes all acts involved in the capture, acquisition, or disposal of a person with intent to reduce him to slavery, all acts involved in the acquisition of a slave with a view to selling or exchanging him, all acts of disposal by sale or exchange of a slave acquired with a view of being sold or exchanged, and in general, every act of trade or transport in slaves. So ownership on the one hand and trade on the other hand are the two activities which are prohibited, or two facts which are prohibited by the 1926 Convention. And as we have said, despite of abolition, slavery or some aspects of slavery still exist in context of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, trafficking of human organs, or even in selling boys or girls in context of forced marriage.
And now the last part about labor rights, how they are divided, and we will then go to the example how they can be enforced as part of the sustainable development clauses under free trade agreements. So beginning with the content of those rights, there are a few that are considered to be the most important ones. So firstly, freedom of association and collective bargaining. This can be enforced by strong labor unions, particularly. Of course, there are countries that have stronger labor unions and stronger protective rights regarding the position of those unions that can, for example, then negotiate agreements with employers. Then there is a prohibition of forced and child labor, and then a rule of non-discrimination in employment, especially when it comes to race, religion, as well as sexual orientation, gender, of course. So the general rule that employers shouldn't discriminate against employees or candidates for some posts, some functions during recruitment processes. One of the ways how these rights, labor rights, are protected through trade agreements is when provisions that relate to labor laws, labor rights are included in the sustainable development and trade chapters. And here you can see an example from an agreement concluded by the European Union with South Korea. And this shows how sustainable development, in this particular case, related to labor rights and labor freedoms, how it can be enforced through a specific kind of a tool that is a trade agreement. So this is the way how countries work on improving on sustainable development goals. In this case, in this agreement with South Korea, the European Union proposed, because this is those chapters are usually proposed by the European Union as a template during negotiations. In this case, the parties agreed that they will work on ratifying certain ILO, International Labour Organization, conventions. And these fundamental conventions, their aim is to protect these rights that we talked about. So freedom of association, for example, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, that is one of the goals as well, abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. So on the basis of these provisions, an important case emerged. It ended in 2021. It started way before, when the EU initiated governmental consultations with South Korea. So the EU started proceedings against South Korea using this chapter that I showed you over labor rights infringements in South Korea. So the EU had a view that South Korea doesn't really provide for enough protection of freedom of association regarding labor unions, but also that South Korea doesn't do enough to ratify certain ILO conventions that were written in the chapter as an obligation to undertake efforts to conclude and ratify those conventions. And the panel of experts that adjudicated in this case found that Korea was in breach of those obligations, at least part of those obligations contained in Sustainable Development and Trade chapter. And also the panel confirmed that those obligations are binding. So the obligations that relate to sustainable development, relate to labor laws, are binding, although they are quite vague. They are contained in trade agreements that focus, of course, on trade, on minimizing trade barriers, but nevertheless, those obligations were considered to be valid. And this is one of the examples how sustainable development can be enforced. In this case, through a bilateral relation between two countries, two parties to one agreement. Although there's no sanction in this case for non-compliance with the verdict of the panel of experts, still it seems that South Korea undertook some steps to improve in fields that were mentioned in the recommendations proposed by the panel of experts.
Our class is coming to an end, but we would like to share a few references that we used and you may also use to further your knowledge of the topics we covered today. On the United Nations website, you may find crucial information on SDG number 8, its targets and indicators. The text of the treaties can be found on the website of the United Nations Treaty Collection. Plenty of valuable information is available at the websites of the WTO, the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, just to name a few. If you would like to learn more about the EU-Korea case, all the documents are available under the link which is displayed on the screen. You may also want to check the portal for visualization of material flows to verify the interactions on your own. The Oxford-based Our World in Data offers also a tracker for SDG 8, which might be interesting for you. Unless indicated otherwise, and of course not counting the logos, our images came from the following sources: public domain, open access image databases such as Pexels or Unsplash, as well as Wikipedia when it comes to maps. We hope you enjoyed it. We surely did. See you next time.